Today I'm going to talk about the role of translation in the making of Indian literature and arts. Translation, by translation, we normally mean transference of a text from one language to another. And a lot of books on translation theory focus on this kind of transference from language A to language B. The translation of a text, it could be a written text or a spoken text. What is a text? It's a connected piece of language according to linguistics. If we record conversation between two mad people, it's not a text. It's a piece of language. It's not a text. It's not a connected piece of language. So translation means predominantly it's understood to be a linguistic category. The whole idea of translation that we are now working with, both practice and theory, has come to us after colonialism through English. If you look at pre-modern Indian languages, I've done a lot of research into this. There is no word in any one of our languages which is the equivalent of the English word translation. Of course, today, all our languages have word for translation, which are the rough and ready translations of the English word translation. We call it Anuvada in Kannada, Tarjuma in Urdu, Modiperpu in Tamil, Bhashantar in some languages. But all these words have come down to us from English. They are rough and ready translations of the English word translation. So the word was not there in pre-modern Indian languages. And the theory was not there. But translation practice was ubiquitous in pre-modern Indian literatures. In fact, many of our modern Indian languages, the medieval period also, not even modern, they began with translation. The origin of Marathi literature began with translation, and the Kannada literature, Pampa's Adipurana, was a translation. Even the Tamil epic Silapadigaram is the literary translation of a folk or tribal tale. The translation has been coeval with creativity in Indian languages. And the two major texts, Indian texts, Ramayana and the Mahabharata, have been translated into all the Indian languages, not just the major languages, written languages, but also into a lot of tribal languages. For example, the Ramayana of the Bili people of Gujarat is totally different in plot and structure than the Sanskrit Ramayana or the Sanskrit Mahabharata. But what kind of translation did our people practice in ancient and medieval period? When we, in the modern context, talk about translation, we're talking about translations where there's equivalence between the source text and the translated text. And the quality of translation is often judged on the basis of to what extent it brings out the essence of the source text. Translation theorists talk about two kinds of translation, two kinds of equivalence. Formal equivalence. For example, certain literary genres have certain specific formal qualities. You are translating a sonnet from one of the European languages, it's got a particular rhyme scheme. You are translating a ghazal from Urdu into any other language, Urdu ghazal has a specific kind of rhyme scheme. Now the problem with the translator is how to get this rhyme into the target language. In some languages, it's easy to get rhymes. In some languages, it's very difficult. For example, there's a difference in the rhyme scheme between Italian sonnet and English sonnet. Because Italian is a language where it's easy to find rhymes. Because most of the Italian words are vowel ending. Whereas English is a language which is consonant ending. So, when Shakespeare and his contemporaries wanted to develop English sonnet, they had to work out a different kind of rhyme scheme. So there are some formal questions to be addressed when we translate. But the consensus of many of the translation theorists is that what is important is to bring about what is called affective equivalence. The translated poem should have the same aesthetic impact on the reader as the source text. For example, if somebody is translating William Blake's famous poem, the tiger, 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 burning bright in the forest of the night, what immortal hand and eye could frame thy fearful symmetry, etc., etc., it may be difficult to keep the same rhyme scheme in other languages, but one has to find ways, innovative ways of transferring that affective meaning into the target language. So, whether we are talking about formal equivalence or affective equivalence, we are talking about equivalence still. But when we are looking at pre-modern Indian translations, I am focusing mainly on pre-modern Indian translations, at the same time emphasizing that similar translation practices were also there in pre-modern Europe, and also they continue in contemporary period. This kind of translation in present-day discourse is called adaptation. Now, what's the difference between adaptation and translation? For example, when Shakespeare first came to be translated into Indian languages, there were two kinds of translations. The translations normally kept the names of the characters the same, whereas adaptations borrowed the plot of the play and they retained the characters of the source text but changed the cultural details. For example, in Kannada, there was a very important translation of Othello by a scholar from Mysore court called Basavappa Shastri. It's called Shurasena Charita. Othello became Shurasena Charita. The same plot, but there are times when the translation becomes ineffective because some of the cultural details in the source text, unless you change the situation completely, do not work in the translated text. For example, in Othello, when Iago sows seeds of suspicion in the mind of Othello about his wife, Desdemona, he talks about some situations where she is exchanging, hugging and kissing Cassio, which is quite normal in European culture. But it doesn't work in Indian culture. So when she first comes to this place from the sea, Shakespeare compares her to Aphrodite, the Greek goddess. And Basavappa Shastri compares her to Lakshmi. Lakshmi, according to Indian mythology, is also born of the sea. Though he can find the mythological equivalence, the the source of action, one of the important sources of action, which is the murder of Desdemona in this play, it's suspicion in the mind of Othello, that is not justified in the Kannada text, in spite of the enormous poetic richness of this translated text. Because translation is not just a linguistic act, it's also a cultural act. Now, again, I'm talking about equivalence question. But let me give some examples from pre-modern Indian texts. For example, the first Kannada poet, Adikavi Pampa, is a translator. He translated a Jain epic by Jinasena Acharya called Adi Purana. Adi Purana means the story of origins. It's the story of the first great Tirthankara saint of Jainism, Adinatha Tirthankara. One of the narrative techniques that he uses in this text is called Bhavavali, the cycle of rebirths. The same characters are born again and again in life after life in different situations to explore the same passions of love, hatred, and so on. This is a technique that the Buddha used in his Jataka tales, in Buddhist Jataka tales. Before Buddha became enlightened, he had to go through so many lives to qualify himself for enlightenment. Anyway, this happens with Jaina saints, with Adinatha Tirthankara, who is the hero, protagonist of this epic. Now, one of the most dramatic situations in this text is Adinatha Tirthankara, his earlier name is Puru Chakravarti. He is the conqueror of 14 worlds. And after conquering all the 14 worlds, the king of gods, Indra, organizes a dance recital for his, to please him. And the dancer is a heavenly damsel called Neelanjani. When she's dancing, and Pampa gives such a beautiful description of this, at that time, according to Jaina mythology, gods and goddesses are not immortal. They can live for a very long time, thousands of years, billions of years, but they are mortal. And the sign of the death is the garland of flowers they are wearing begins to wither. So Neelanjana's garland of flowers begins to wither, and Indra knows her time has come. At the same time, in order not to disturb the aesthetic enjoyment of Puru Chakravarti, he creates a double with his magical powers and dance goes on. Now, this is an important situation both in original text, Purva Purana by Jinasena Acharya, who was the guru of one of the greatest emperors of Karnataka, Nripatunga, and then Pampa, who wrote it 2 centuries later in Kannada. Now, the important difference is the length of the text. Purva Purana is at least 20 times longer than the Kannada translation. Just as the Sanskrit Mahabharata is at least 10-15 times longer than Kannada Mahabharata by Kumar Vyasa. Now, in the source text, Purva Purana, because Jinasena Acharya is a Jain monk, he is not very sensitive to the beauty of women. So he describes Neelanjana's dance only in 5-6 stanzas. Then in 60-70 stanzas, he describes his Puru Chakravarti's disillusionment with the sensory world. But in the Kannada text, just the opposite happens. Pampa is a great lover of beauty. He often boasts of his fondness for different kinds of regional beauties. And he spends 30 stanzas on describing Neelanjana's dance and the disillusionment part only in 5-6 stanzas. So what's happening here? He is not being loyal to the source text. Number one is much more abbreviated. Plus, in the most crucial scene of this text, he shifts the emphasis. This has happened in various translations of the Rama and the Mahabharata also. For example, there is a Kannada Jaina translation of the Ramayana called by a poet called Abhinava Pampa, Ramachandra Deva Charita. Now, the crux of the story in many Mahabharatas is that Ravana kidnaps Sita and is punished, and Rama kills him at the end. But in Jaina Ramayana, it's not Rama who kills Ravana, it's Lakshmana who kills Ravana. The reason is this. The reason is, just as in Jainism, one has to go up the ladder of evolution for in many lifetimes to attain perfection. Similarly, a protagonist of Jainism has to climb up many ladders to reach perfection. And Rama is almost there. He's almost a Tirthankara. So he cannot kill anybody, because Jainism emphasizes, the essence of Jainism is ahimsa, non-violence. So this act of killing, the poet shifts to Lakshmana instead of to Rama. There's another very interesting translation, if you call it a translation, of the Mahabharata in Kannada. Of course, there are many folk versions of Mahabharata. I am talking about Mahabharata, an oral epic of the Hakkipikke tribes of Karnataka, the bird catchers tribe. Now here, I want to show you how this translation completely turns upside down one of the most important episodes of the Mahabharata, that is the game of dice, where Pandavas play dice with the Kauravas, they lose it, and they go into, they expel into the forest. But in this Hakkipikke Ramayana, Mahabharata, after all the 5 Pandavas lose the game, Draupadi says, "You men, you are useless. Now I'll play the game of dice." She sits down and she defeats all the Kauravas, and in this version of the Ramayana, she sends all Kauravas into forest and Pandavas rule Hastinavati. Now when we talked about Pampa's translation, it's about limited equivalence. Now when we talk about Hakkipikke Ramayana, completely topsy-turvy. The whole text has changed its emphasis. So in pre-modern India, translation, or let's take another great example, Kalidasa's play, Abhignana Shakuntalam, which is based on a sub-story, a upakhyana of the Mahabharata. In this story, Dushyanta is a macho guy. There is no Durvasa, there is no curse. When Shakuntala comes, he pretends not to recognize her. So he's not a hero, he's a villain of the piece. But Kalidasa changes the whole story, because Sanskrit drama has a structure, and the protagonist must have a certain characteristics. He should be Dhira Shringada, Dhirodatta, etc. He can't commit such a heinous act. So he creates this whole situation of Durvasa's curse, because of which the Dushyanta has this amnesia and is not able to recognize her. It's no fault of his. Moreover, he also brings in the whole episode of the ring, which she loses on her way to Dushyanta's capital, which is followed up by a fish. Then somebody else, fisherman, brings it, and after years, because when Durvasa gives a curse to Dushyanta, he also says, after some years, he will remember you, and then he remembers it. There's a beautiful stanza in which he remembers it, and I'm not going to, it's one of my favorite slokas, I'm not going into that. So, the translation practice in pre-modern India was either limited equivalence, sometimes no equivalence, sometimes complete reversal, as in the case of Hakkipikke Ramayana. The Bili Mahabharata, in Bili Mahabharata, the central character is not none of the Pandavas, it is Draupadi. And Draupadi in the Bili Mahabharata is equated with Adi Shakti. Arjuna worships her Adi Shakti. There are other versions of the Ramayana in the Southeast Asia. For example, in Bali Islands, they have a very famous Ramayana play and also the Mahabharata play. In the Mahabharata there, the heroes are not none of these Bhima, Arjuna or anybody, it's Sahadeva. So now I'm extending this kind of translation practice outside India to the rest of Southeast Asia. If one looks at different translations of the Ramayana in Southeast Asia, one can see how free this translation activity can be. So, this kind of translation practice was widespread, vibrant in pre-modern India. The Ramayanas, which were translated into regional languages during the medieval period, had a completely different orientation than Sanskrit Ramayana, Sanskrit Mahabharata. For example, Kumaravyasa, the translator of Kannada Mahabharata, says in his introductory verses, Nandi Padyas, Tidiya Hedive Krishna Katayanu Yeya Janaru Mechu Vandadi. For him, Mahabharata is not the stories of Kauravas or Pandavas, it's the story of Lord Krishna. Though it's not Bhagavata, where Krishna is the protagonist, Krishna is everywhere. Krishna is the still center of this Mahabharata. He says it's Krishna's story. And the Ramayanas that were translated in the medieval period, they're not heroic stories, they're devotional texts. They're called Adhyatma Ramayanas. Tulsidas Ramcharitmanas and Edutachan's Ramayanam, the Malayalam, they are devotional Ramayanas where Ramayana story becomes an allegory for the relationship between individual soul and the cosmic soul. Okay, so these are different, if we look at the translation practice in pre-modern India, they are of a different nature. And before I conclude, I want to argue that the same kind of translation practice existed in pre-modern Europe. If you look at the translation of the Homeric epics into Greek tragedies or the popular stories and popular texts into Shakespearean plays, the translators take a lot of freedom, and so translation activity is much more variegated and much more, many layered than what we assume to be because of the limited notion of translation that we have inherited from the colonial period. Thank you.